April 24, 1865, Vicksburg, Mississippi. The Civil War had ended just weeks earlier, and along the muddy bluffs above the river, a column of men shuffled slowly down toward the water. They were gaunt. Some weighed less than 100 pounds. Many hadn't eaten a real meal in months. These were Union soldiers, freshly released from the most notorious prison camps the war had produced. Places like Andersonville and Cahaba, camps where starvation and disease had killed more men than any battlefield. Now, finally, they were going home. Waiting for them at the dock was a steamboat called the Sultana. Within 72 hours, it would become the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. Worse than the Titanic, worse than the Lusitania, and almost nobody alive today has ever heard of it. To understand how a disaster this size could simply vanish from public memory, you have to understand the moment in history it landed in. The Confederacy had just surrendered. Lincoln had just been assassinated, shot barely 2 weeks earlier. And the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth was still consuming every headline in the country. A nation that had spent 4 years drowning in death was, for a few strange weeks, almost numb to it. Into that narrow window of exhausted, distracted America, the Sultana was about to sail. The Sultana herself was nothing special, a wooden side-wheel steamboat, 260 feet long, built 2 years earlier in a Cincinnati boatyard. She ran a regular route up and down the Mississippi, hauling cargo and passengers between St. Louis and New Orleans. Her legal capacity, the number stamped into her documents, allowed for 376 people, crew included. On the night she left Vicksburg, she would be carrying more than 6 times that number. The story of how that happened begins with money, and with one man's decision to protect it instead of the lives in his care. The federal government, eager to bring freed prisoners of war back north as quickly as possible, was paying steamboat captains a bounty for every soldier they transported. $5 a head for enlisted men, $10 for officers. In 1865, that wasn't pocket change, it was a fortune. And Captain J. Cass Mason, part owner of the Sultana, understood exactly what that fortune could mean if he could just get enough soldiers onto his boat before a rival vessel did. There was a problem standing in his way, and it wasn't paperwork, it was steel. While docked at Vicksburg for a routine stop, one of the Sultana's 4 boilers was found to be leaking, a serious flaw in a system that relied on those boilers holding pressure evenly across the entire ship. The boat's engineer inspected the damage and gave Mason a clear recommendation that at least 2 full sheets of the boiler needed to be replaced entirely, a repair that would take real time, real money, and would keep the Sultana docked long enough for a competing steamboat to scoop up the soldiers waiting to board. Mason chose the faster option. Instead of the replacement his own engineer recommended, workers simply hammered a thin patch over the weakened section, a temporary fix meant to hold just long enough to get the boat moving again. It was the kind of decision that looks, in hindsight, almost impossibly reckless. At the time, it looked like nothing more than an inconvenient delay, quietly resolved. With the patch in place, Mason turned his full attention to the soldiers gathering on the bluffs above Vicksburg. There were, by this point, thousands of them, released prisoners from multiple camps, all funneled into the same holding area, all waiting for transport north. 3 steamboats sat ready to take them. Under normal circumstances, the Army was supposed to distribute prisoners fairly evenly across available vessels, spreading both the load and the profits. That system fell apart almost immediately, because the officer overseeing the loading, an Army captain named George Williams, had grown suspicious that some of his fellow officers were quietly taking bribes from steamboat owners to funnel more soldiers onto their boats. In a fit of frustration and haste, trying to cut through what he believed was corruption, Williams made the situation drastically worse instead of better. He ordered nearly the entire group of paroled prisoners loaded onto a single vessel, the Sultana. What followed was one of the most staggering overloading events in the history of American transportation. Men climbed aboard by the hundreds, then the thousands, packed onto every deck, crammed into every corridor, lying shoulder to shoulder across the open hurricane deck at the very top of the boat, because there was simply nowhere else left to put them. Estimates of the exact number vary slightly depending on the source, but the consensus among historians places somewhere between 2,100 and 2,400 people aboard a boat rated to carry 376. The physical strain on the vessel was visible to anyone who looked. The upper deck, never designed to bear this kind of concentrated weight, began to visibly sag under the crush of bodies, forcing crew members to scramble and install emergency wooden support beams underneath, just to keep it from collapsing outright before the boat had even left the dock. Cargo added to the imbalance too. Along with the human cargo, the Sultana was hauling roughly 250 barrels of sugar, along with dozens of mules, horses, and hogs, all crowded onto the lower decks alongside soldiers too weak to protest their conditions. One of the boat's own clerks reportedly remarked, almost with pride, that if the Sultana made it upriver safely, it would set a record. The largest number of passengers ever carried on a single trip up the Mississippi. Nobody framing it that way seemed to fully register what that same fact actually meant, that they were about to send an unprecedented mass of human beings up a flooded, swollen river, balanced on top of a boiler that had just been patched rather than properly repaired. Late in the evening of April 24th, the Sultana finally pulled away from the Vicksburg wharf and began pushing north against the current. The Mississippi that spring was running unusually high and fast, swollen far beyond its normal banks by heavy rains, which meant the boat's engines were already working harder than usual just to make ordinary progress upriver. Survivors later described an atmosphere on board that, in the earliest hours at least, felt almost celebratory. These were men who had survived combat, survived disease, survived the horror of Confederate prison camps, and were now, finally, on their way home. Some sang. Some simply sat in stunned, grateful silence, watching the riverbank slide slowly past. As the boat continued upriver over the following 2 days, stopping briefly at Memphis on the evening of April 26th to unload cargo and take on coal, the overcrowding problem never actually resolved itself. If anything, the imbalance grew more dangerous the longer the trip continued. Whenever the Sultana passed another vessel heading downriver, or drifted near a farm along the bank, the men crowded eagerly to whichever side offered the better view, shifting hundreds of pounds of weight all at once. Captain Mason, aware of exactly how precarious his boat's balance had become, was reduced to pleading with soldiers to stay still, to distribute themselves evenly, fully conscious that a sudden shift could tip the entire vessel. What almost nobody on board could see, because it was happening below deck inside sealed iron chambers, was a second, quieter danger building alongside the obvious one. The Sultana's 4 boilers were interconnected, designed so that water levels equalized automatically between them. Every time the boat rocked from a sudden shift in passenger weight, water sloshed unevenly between the connected boilers, meaning some ran with too little water covering critical surfaces, while others ran with too much. Too little water over superheated metal is its own kind of catastrophe waiting to happen, and it was happening again and again, invisibly, every time hundreds of exhausted soldiers leaned toward one railing to watch the shoreline pass. The Sultana left Memphis around 11 o'clock that night, continuing north into darkness, carrying her overwhelming, exhausted cargo of freed soldiers ever closer to home. Roughly 7 miles upriver from Memphis, at about 2 o'clock in the morning on April 27th, the patched boiler finally gave way. Survivors described the initial blast less as an explosion and more as the sky itself tearing open directly beneath their feet. 3 of the 4 boilers detonated in rapid succession, the force of it ripping straight up through the crowded decks above, launching scalding steam, jagged metal shrapnel, and burning wooden debris hundreds of feet into the night air. The sound was reportedly audible for miles in every direction along the riverbank, a single, thunderous concussion loud enough to wake residents sleeping in Memphis itself. The immediate carnage was almost incomprehensible in scale. An estimated 400 people were killed instantly, in the first few seconds, by the force of the blast alone or by scalding steam that swept across entire sections of packed decking in an instant, Men who had survived years of war and disease, killed in a heartbeat by the very transport meant to finally bring them home. The explosion tore straight through the boat's twin smokestacks, which came crashing down onto the crowded deck below, crushing dozens more men who had no possible way to see it coming in the pitch darkness of 2 a.m. Within moments, the wreckage of the shattered upper decks caught fire, and the flames spread with terrifying speed across a structure built almost entirely out of dry, aged wood, soaked in the same oil and coal dust that had powered its engines for 2 years. Soldiers who had survived the initial blast now found themselves trapped between 2 equally lethal choices: an inferno rapidly consuming the deck beneath them, or the black, churning floodwaters of a Mississippi River running high, fast, and freezing cold in the pre-dawn hours of late April. Most chose the river. Many of them shouldn't have, not because staying was safer, but because survival in that water demanded something the vast majority of them simply didn't have. According to multiple historical accounts, the overwhelming majority of the soldiers on board that night, farm boys from Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and across the rural Midwest, had never learned to swim. They tore free whatever pieces of wood, doors, railings, anything at all that might float, and threw themselves over the side into total darkness, into water so cold it could stop a man's heart within minutes, even without factoring in exhaustion, malnourishment, or untreated wounds from years spent in prison camps. The river itself, already swollen far beyond its banks from the spring floods, had spread out into the surrounding lowlands, submerging trees, fence posts, and farmland for miles in every direction. That flooding, so dangerous in every other respect, became one of the very few pieces of fortune in an otherwise catastrophic night. Survivors clinging to floating wreckage drifted for miles through the darkness and found again and again half-submerged trees rising up out of the water, something solid to grab onto and climb, a place to wait out the freezing hours until rescue came or daylight arrived. One survivor was later found nearly 10 miles downstream, having survived the entire ordeal by clinging to the floating carcass of a dead mule that had been thrown overboard in the initial explosion, using the animal's body as a makeshift raft through the darkest hours of the night. Word of the disaster reached Memphis within the hour, carried by the sound of the explosion itself and by the first exhausted, half-frozen survivors who managed to reach shore. Every available boat in the city, private vessels, fishing boats, anything that could float, was pressed into emergency rescue service before sunrise. Crews rowing out into the flooded darkness by torchlight, pulling half-drowned, badly burned survivors out of the current, one at a time, working for hours as the freezing night slowly gave way to morning. By the time rescue efforts finally wound down over the following days, the death toll stood as almost incomprehensible. Historical estimates differ slightly depending on exactly how the initial passenger count is calculated, since so many soldiers had been loaded onto the boat informally, without complete manifests. But the consensus among modern historians places the number who died somewhere between 1,100 and 1,200 people, out of a total of somewhere between 2,100 and 2,400 souls who had been aboard. That death toll exceeds the Titanic by several hundred people. It remains, to this day, the single deadliest maritime disaster in the entire history of the United States. And yet, if you ask the average American today what happened aboard the Sultana, the overwhelming majority will have no idea what you're even referring to. That isn't an accident of poor record keeping. It's almost entirely a matter of timing. The disaster occurred just 12 days after Lincoln's assassination, while the country's newspapers, telegraph lines, and public attention were still almost completely consumed by the ongoing manhunt for John Wilkes Booth, who was tracked down and killed by Union soldiers just 2 days before the Sultana ever exploded. National papers that might, under any other circumstances, have devoted extensive front-page coverage to the worst maritime disaster in the nation's history instead buried the story deep inside their pages, if they covered it in meaningful detail at all. A war-weary nation, already numb from 4 years of almost unimaginable casualty counts, simply didn't have the emotional or journalistic bandwidth left to fully absorb one more tragedy, even one on this scale. In the aftermath, a military inquiry was convened to determine exactly how a disaster of this magnitude had been allowed to happen in the first place, examining both the mechanical failure of the patched boiler and the human decisions that had led to such a catastrophic degree of overcrowding. Investigators pointed directly at the overloading as a central, unavoidable cause, questioning why standard Army procedures for distributing prisoners evenly across available vessels had been so completely abandoned in favor of loading nearly the entire group onto one single boat. Suspicions of bribery and financial corruption among the officers responsible for prisoner transport ran throughout the investigation. Allegations that steamboat owners were paying certain officials directly to steer more soldiers, and therefore more government bounty money, toward their own vessels. Despite the scale of the disaster and the clear evidence of both mechanical negligence and administrative failure, remarkably few people were ever formally held accountable in any lasting way. Captain Mason, the man whose decision to patch rather than properly repair the failing boiler set the entire disaster in motion, did not survive the explosion himself, killed in the very catastrophe his choices had helped create. Several officers connected to the loading and bribery allegations faced courts-martial and official inquiry, but in the chaotic, exhausted final weeks of a nation just emerging from civil war, meaningful, lasting consequences proved difficult to secure. No one was ever convicted of a crime directly tied to the disaster. Perhaps the most quietly remarkable part of the entire Sultana story unfolded not in Washington or in any courtroom, but along the muddy, flooded banks of the Mississippi itself, in the hours immediately following the explosion. Much of the surrounding land near the wreck site sat within territory that had, until just weeks earlier, belonged to the Confederacy, and many of the residents living along that stretch of riverbank were former Confederate soldiers and civilians who had spent the last 4 years fighting against the very Union soldiers now drowning and burning in the water in front of them. And yet, in the immediate aftermath, accounts describe local Confederate veterans rowing out into the dark, flooded river themselves, risking their own lives to pull half-frozen Union soldiers out of the current, offering blankets, food, and shelter to men who, mere weeks before, would have been considered their sworn enemies. In the wreckage of one of the war's final, strangest tragedies, some of the very first hands reaching down to pull survivors from the water belonged to the soldiers they had so recently been fighting against. In the decades that followed, survivors of the Sultana explosion did what they could to keep the memory of that night from disappearing entirely, forming survivor associations, holding annual reunions, and pushing, largely unsuccessfully, for the kind of national recognition and memorial attention that other disasters of comparable scale eventually received. A modest number of memorials and museum exhibits exist today, scattered across Tennessee, Arkansas, and the soldiers' home states throughout the Midwest, along with a small, dedicated museum in Marion, Arkansas, near where the wreck itself is believed to still lie buried today, shifted and reburied over the past century and a half by the ever-changing course of the Mississippi River itself. The very waterway that swallowed so many lives, now quietly holding what remains of the boat that carried them. What makes the Sultana disaster linger for those who do eventually learn about it isn't simply the staggering death toll, though that alone would be more than enough to justify its place in American memory. It's the layering of small, preventable human decisions stacked one directly on top of another. A patched boiler instead of a proper repair. A bribery scandal that led one frustrated officer to overload a single boat instead of distributing soldiers safely across 3. A captain's hunger for government bounty money outweighing his own engineers' direct warning. None of these decisions on their own would have been enough to cause a disaster of this scale. Together, compounding on top of each other across just a handful of days in April 1865, they combined to kill more Americans in a single night than would die decades later aboard the Titanic, on a boat nobody today remembers, in a tragedy that vanished almost immediately into the shadow of a president's assassination and the final gasping weeks of a war that had already cost the nation more lives than it could properly grieve all at once. The soldiers aboard the Sultana had survived Confederate bullets. They had survived the starvation and disease of Andersonville and Cahaba, 2 of the deadliest prison camps in American history. They had endured years away from home, certain that the worst of the war was finally, mercifully behind them. For 1,100 of those men, the very last mile of that journey, the stretch of river between Vicksburg and home, would turn out to be the most dangerous one of all. Not because of anything the Confederacy had done to them, but because of a patched boiler, a corrupt loading order, and a boat carrying 6 times the number of souls it was ever built to hold. Quietly steaming north through the darkness of a flooded Mississippi River, toward a moment that history would almost completely forget.